President and CEO of Project Assistance, and Jim Colton, Practice Director of Portfolio and Project Management. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Gus Cicala founded Project Assistance in 1996 with the goal of transforming our clients' approach to portfolio and project management to achieve a standard of excellence in execution that consistently delivers expected project outcomes. A recognized portfolio and project management expert, Gus is a published author of many popular articles and books on the subject of project management, and he's frequently asked to present and teach topics of interest around project and portfolio management. Gus?
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for attending our session today. I'd first like to go over the agenda. Just for reference reasons, we're going to go over project and portfolio management and overview. We'll talk about an approach to project portfolio management. There'll be a demonstration of Microsoft's portfolio and project management tool. We'll talk a little bit at the end of the demonstration about improving portfolio and project management, some next steps, and as Dan mentioned, we'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. So first we want to just give a general overview of project portfolio management, put things in context. And I'd like to go over this idea of where portfolio management fits in context of an overall organization. So if we think about an organization having a mission and a set of values and a vision in order to achieve that mission, oftentimes that vision gets translated into what we would call a strategy. And I like simple three-word definitions, and I've heard a good definition a few years ago, and I use it a lot. The first time I heard it, I didn't like it, but the more I talk about it and the more I think about it, the more it makes sense to me. And that three-word definition is a plan for change. And the idea here is that if there's a vision of the future of what the organization will become, a strategy, in fact, does define what those plans for change are. Something has to change to get us from where we are now to where we're trying to get to. And that's where a strategy comes into play. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between strategy and execution for a variety of reasons I won't get into today. But some examples would be that the strategy maybe is not well documented, or that it's out of date, that a strategy should be organic and should be alive and should be visited on a regular basis. So there's a lot of reasons why strategies and the execution of those strategies get disconnected. So what we want to do is we want to drill in a little bit deeper into this idea about what happens between strategy and execution, and the idea that the tactical plans that oftentimes are put in place to execute a strategy are really projects, right? So project execution sometimes can be out of sync with the strategy that the organization has, and we want to really explore that further today. So, at the end of the day, the company has to plan a slate of projects to achieve the corporate mission. If you were on our last webinar, you would have heard me refer to projects as vessels. When we're running projects, we're traveling in these vessels of change. That this vessel is taking us out to that vision on the horizon, and execution is how we reach that vision out on the horizon. So this is portfolio management, the idea of creating a set of ideas, and we call it project portfolio management because it's not financial portfolio management or real estate portfolio management. There's all different kinds of portfolios out there, but we're talking specifically about the kinds of initiatives that get put into a strategy that form the plan for change, that ultimately those initiatives turn out to be projects. And just to talk a little bit about the value of portfolio project management, we see a graphic on the screen. And it says at the top that project portfolio management enables organizations to identify and select the investments that will maximize business value. So what's the idea? The same thing we would have for a financial portfolio. We want to optimize the output of our portfolio so that we have the best possible outcomes. And on the right-hand side, it says project management enables organizations to successfully deliver the selected business value opportunities. And we just have just a quick visual here that shows on the y-axis it says the ability to identify business value potential, and we see a 66% or two-thirds if an organization achieves two-thirds of its ability to identify business value. And on the x-axis, we see 75% achieved of the ability to realize business value potential. And it says 50% lost value. So what does that mean? Well, if we do the simple math of taking two-thirds of 75%, we're only going to achieve about 50% of the value realized. So while it may sound, I'll say, decent to have achieve two-thirds of our potential to identify value and three-quarters of our ability to realize it, in fact, we see the shortcomings on the portfolio management side up in the headroom on the top at losing a third there and then losing 25% of the delivery capability in project management. That's a tremendous loss. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about looking at the return on investment of doing this better. And so what are the organizational challenges with getting better at project portfolio management? First of all, increasing work requires better understanding and communication. Okay, so always the better understanding and communication becomes a challenge for the organization. Sometimes projects bypass the project prioritization process, and it causes resource conflict. So having things that are basically in the portfolio but haven't been acknowledged as being in the portfolio is a huge challenge for a lot of portfolios that are trying to be managed. Technology project is viewed as an IT process. Okay, so sometimes an organization thinks, well, we put it in our strategy and we funded it, so IT just needs to do their thing. And by the way, we don't quite understand what they do, so we're just going to leave them alone, and we're going to expect them to deliver according to our expectations without deep involvement. Project governance committees have no real authority to fund projects, or the opposite, to cancel projects. Right? So how do we have a governance body that has teeth in it? Resource constraints. This necessitates shared resources that shared resources are allocated to the highest priority projects. And what does that mean? It means the other projects suffer. So when we're not seeing a portfolio-wide view of resource management, resource utilization, resource capacity, and what's available to support the portfolio, oftentimes the commitment to portfolios comes up short. No process in place to stop projects that are off track, so I mentioned that already, under the authority of governance committees or steering committees to cancel projects that have gone bad. Cost-benefit analysis, not validated to confirm the projects are delivering value. Okay, so a big one on this is, for example, marketing comes through and says we believe that the market opportunity is $10 million in sales, and a big part of the question here is, is that number real? And if it's not real, then does that really present a valid business case for this project to go forward? So at this point, we're going to change the topic over to an approach for portfolio management. What I'd like to do is turn this over to Colton. Jim?
Thanks, Gus. A second to read that quote. So in my experience, I've found that organizations that have adopted a defined process with clear roles and responsibilities have a much greater probability of successfully implementing that process. Today, we'll share a high-level view of the project portfolio management process as a potential best practice that can be leveraged by organizations. We recommend, as an organization begins to pursue a formal PPM methodology process, that they start with a proven best practice model and then customize the process to fit your organization's specific needs and requirements. This view is a 6-step process that takes you from the initiation of a request or an idea all the way through the analysis of the portfolio and continuous improvement. The next several slides, I'm going to drill down on each of these boxes and talk about some recommendations or ideas on how to be successful in each step of the way. First step, central collection and management of project requests. So I feel it's important to standardize the process for collection of ideas. It's important to have a standard template or form and a common input so that individuals know how to submit ideas or potential opportunities for improving the organization. We don't want to lose any good ideas. Before undergoing an in-depth feasibility study, it's often important to conduct an initial screening or filtering of ideas that don't make sense, or ideas that aren't necessarily aligned with the business goals and objectives. We also want to ensure alignment of that request or idea with the business strategy that Gus had mentioned earlier. It's important to have the connection from the mission and vision and values all the way through the portfolio and project management capabilities. Second step in the process is business case management. So we think it's imperative to use a common cost-benefit or CBA template for project comparison purposes. You don't want to have one project use a 3-year model and another project use a 5-year model and try to compare them. Or you don't want to try to compare a net present value to a payback period or an internal rate of return. So in order to best compare projects for selection, you want to use a common CBA template. We want to gather both high-level costs and benefits. It might be earlier in the process, all requirements for the project may not be known, but it's good to have an order of magnitude estimate of both costs and benefits to include in the CBA. This provides a starting point for further analysis. Gus also mentioned earlier the validation of the business case. So we feel that's real important for sustaining continuous improvement with the process and holding executives to what they're responsible for delivering on. If you're launching a new product, it's easy to see the benefits of a new product just by comparing a baseline of 0 to the new revenue that's generated. But it could be more difficult to compare, say, an enhancement to an existing product or service, where there's other variables such as market growth, increased competition, and other variables like that. So you want to make some assumptions as you prevent your CBA and baseline that operational metric in terms of how you'll validate those benefits post-project. Third step in the process is initiative review, rating, evaluation. It could be that your organization has different levels of portfolios. You may have a divisional or department project portfolio, and only a subset of those projects will move up to the enterprise level project portfolio. So it's important to have representation across the division or department at that level, as well as have cross-functional representation at the enterprise level. Remember, we're making decisions that are best for the organization, not for a subset of that organization. So it's important to have that enterprise-wide perspective. We recommend utilizing a project scoring tool to provide input for project selection and prioritization. This is another tool, just like the CBA, as input to decision-making. Today's demo, we're actually going to show a scoring model that can be used. The project scoring tool, it's important that is aligned with your business drivers and business objectives. Again, you want to make the selection based on what's most important to the organization. The selection and approval step is next up. In order to optimize the portfolio, again, it's critical to have representatives from across the department division and make those decisions from an enterprise-wide perspective. The selection should ultimately have a good product or project mix. It's It's important to have a good mix of revenue generation projects, cost reduction projects, risk reduction projects, and you may have other projects that are strictly soft benefits such as process improvement. You can make an analogy to your personal financial portfolio where based on your objectives in terms of retirement and what you need, you may have a different mix of stocks, bonds, cash, or real estate. We also need to consider constraints in terms of potentially budget and people. There's going to be a lot of good ideas and requests to come in, but we're going to be limited in terms of what we can do based on these constraints. And we'll show today how you can utilize constraints in terms of finalizing the portfolio selection. We talked earlier about that good strategic mix of projects, balancing the long term and the short term. Okay, we're going to jump into Project Web Access 2010 to show some functionality within the tool that can support project portfolio management. I'm going to show a three-step process, starting with the driver library. This is the collection of business drivers. We'll go through a driver prioritization step, which is analogous to the scoring model. And finally, we'll go through the steps involved in the actual analysis of projects and selection. And we'll show you how to use what-if scenarios using Web Access 2010. So starting in the driver library, it's important to develop business drivers that will be used in the scoring model that support your business objectives, goals, and your vision. So this library is a collection of all potential business drivers that you'll use in various scoring models. Again, we talked about having different scoring models and portfolios within the organization. Again, you could have a portfolio at the enterprise level and have other portfolios at lower levels in the organization. So this library will enable you to select the drivers that best fit that specific entity. So it's a comprehensive list of drivers that are then selected. Just to show you a little detail behind the business drivers, I'm going to click on Expand into New Markets and Segments. So this is fairly straightforward. In order to set it up, you name the driver, create a description, and then ideally you'll write descriptions for each level, 1 through 5, starting basically how much will the project impact this driver, from no impact all the way up to an extreme impact on the driver. And you want to have good descriptions so it's clear how to rate each driver. Once we've agreed on all the business drivers for the organization, we can then develop an actual scoring model. You do that through step 2, which is driver prioritization. So think of each of these labels as a potentially different scoring model. And you could label them however you feel best fits. You could level 1, you could call it fast revenue growth market or cost containment model. And depending on your business situation, if you're in a high growth market, you want your business drivers to fit that strategy. So you're going to select ultimately more projects that are going to drive increased revenue, and you're not so much worried about cost containment. So again, I'll kind of drill into one of these driver prioritizations or scoring models to show you how it works. You can start by defining the name of the model and giving it a brief description. You can allocate these models, again, to various departments or entities within the organization. You can have a calculated model or a manual model. In other words, when I select the business drivers, I can give them certain weights that add up to 100%. Or I can go through a calculation which uses pairwise comparisons, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. At the bottom is where I select the actual drivers that I want to use in this specific model. So in this example, they've chosen calculate, and what this view here is showing is using pairwise comparisons. So if you're not familiar with pairwise comparisons, it's an analytical technique that's used to evaluate alternatives by providing an easy and reliable means to rate and rank decision-making criteria. It's a technique that's been around since the 1920s, and it's used in a lot of different industries and for different purposes. So I'm not going to go through each example here, but you can see how this works. I'm comparing one driver and making a choice. Is it more important, less important than another driver? And you do that for every combination of drivers that you've selected to be in your scoring model. Once I've gone through this calculated comparison, there's a mathematical algorithm that will then tell you which drivers are most important for that specific department or organization. So in this case, increased market share in existing markets is the most important business driver. And when we go to evaluate each project, the weight of 33.67% will be applied to increase market share. So you can see the sum equals 100%. So essentially, you've prepared yourself to begin your analysis of your portfolio. You've got your business drivers identified, and you've selected the drivers that are most appropriate to put into the scoring model for your department. So now I'm going to go into the actual portfolio analysis component. And if you can picture an example, you may do periodic executive committee reviews of projects, or perhaps you can use this analysis as part of your annual planning within that cycle to choose the projects that you're going to select to work on for the following year. So we've built a few different portfolios here, and I'm just going to select one that says 10 million. So again, in this analysis, I'm going to call it the 2011 portfolio analysis view. I choose which scoring model I want to use for this particular analysis. I can then also select the projects that will be evaluated. So it's important to select not only, say you're doing an annual planning process, you're going through that process to select for the following year. You want to look at not only new proposed projects, but it's important to look at the carryover projects that won't finish this year but will push into next year. I can also identify constraints using the tool. In this case, I'm going to use a total budget cost as my constraint. The next step in the portfolio analysis is to actually score each of the projects. So you're going to see the list of projects here in the vertical row. And in the horizontal, you're going to see all the different business drivers that I've chosen to include in my model. Now we can score these at one individual event, or you can score them as they're initiated and proposed. Today we're not showing you the project workflow process, but you could have a predefined process that goes from initiation into approval into an active project. And you can configure that within Project Web Access. Just for the sake of time, let's say that we've pre-scored all the projects today, and now I'm going to let another mathematical algorithm tell me how important each product is in terms of meeting the business objectives. So here you'll see the list of projects that we selected for this analysis, and the percentage based on 100% that specific project will deliver in terms of the overall business goals and objectives. So it's a very nice analytical technique to quickly come up with some very subjective measures to make decisions. again, it's not, we're not looking for perfection here, but it's an input to making the decision. So the ultimate result, I'm going to hide this one screen so you can see a little bit more of the detail. What we're showing here is based on a constraint of $10.7 million. And these priorities, which we saw on the previous screen, basically the business value of each project, the application has selected those projects that are the best project mix to meet my needs. So you'll see the selected projects, and I'll scroll down, and you'll see the projects that were not selected based on a cost constraint of $10.7 million and the business value of each project. So I'm going to show some metrics here. You can see the total budget constraint is right here, $10.734 million. 14 projects were selected, and based on those 14 projects, I'm actually going to obtain 77% of my business goals and objectives. Again, of course, we're assuming the projects go as planned. The total benefit of these projects upon implementation is expected to be $22 million. This graphic here, it's called the efficient frontier. Very interesting. So you can see the strategic value is on the vertical axis, and the total budget cost is on the horizontal. So even though I've utilized, again, $10 million, $10.7 million, I'm obtaining a very high percentage of my strategic value. The nice thing now is we can do some what-if analysis. And for example, we can modify the budget. I'm going to go from $10.7 million to $11.7 million, and I'm going to recalculate. Now you can see that 15 projects have been selected. I've got a strategic value of 80%. So it's nice, you can do all different types of what-if analyses, and then once you're comfortable that you have the right mix of projects, you can commit it and save it and do comparisons of those committed changes. So we've gone through a few different scenarios offline. We did a $10 million budget constraint. We did a $12 million budget constraint, and the original baseline, which is all the projects have been selected. I can now go in and do a comparison. And you can see, based on the different scenarios, which projects were selected or not selected. And you can see the history of all those changes. This gives executives a great tool to conduct what-if analysis and make good decisions that give the best value for your organization. So in summary, there's a three-step process. You develop your business drivers, make sure they're aligned with your business objectives and goals. You develop different scoring models potentially for different parts of the organization, incorporating the business drivers that make the most sense for that specific department or entity. And then you go through the portfolio analysis and selection process. Getting back to the slide deck, I'm going to walk through the last two steps of the project portfolio management process. So step 5 is measure and respond. So the process needs to be a living and breathing thing, just like your strategic plan should be living and breathing. So we want to adopt the portfolio and modify it based on changes to the business or changes to specific objectives or goals. A best practice practice is to look at the portfolio at least quarterly and potentially more often if there's a dramatic change in the business climate. It's also important to eliminate projects that are poor performing. So we want to analyze the in-flight project portfolio and look at projects that aren't meeting their objectives. They could be behind schedule, over cost, and no longer have the financial benefit that we had thought when we slotted them into the portfolio. We also want to adjust the portfolio based on the dollars and resource constraints. So if we have shifting priorities and individuals may be pulled off projects to go on work on operational activities, we may have to revisit the portfolio and reduce the number of projects that are active. Step 6 is to analyze the portfolio benefits. So again, I think to keep everyone honest with the process and submitting projects with financial business cases, it's important to go back and validate, did this project meet the benefits that were expected? So this process could take place anywhere from 3 months to potentially a year after project go live, depending on the specific benefits that are being obtained. We feel it's imperative to keep a continuous improvement mindset, to continue to look at refining the process, modifying the tools to support that process, educating the stakeholders or the committee, and just continue to make the process better over time. Again, we talked about ensuring the alignment of the portfolio to changing business needs. This is critical. So for example, you could go into a cost containment situation where your net income's below your plan. And at that point, as quickly as possible, you may want to revisit the portfolio and put projects on hold or postpone projects for a later point. I'm going to toss it back to Gus. He's going to walk through the VIA methodology.
Thank you, Jim. Great job. Thanks for doing the hard part. I appreciate that. What we want to talk about now is, what Jim was just talking about was, how we optimize a portfolio and what the various components are that help us to optimize the output from an investment in a portfolio of projects. And what we want to talk about now is how do we optimize the approach to portfolio management. And so the VIA methodology is something I want to spend a few minutes on talking about. And really, this is a question of, how do organizations really use project portfolio management to drive innovation? At the end of the day, this thing I talked about earlier, strategy, this plan for change, is the organization's vehicle for driving innovation. So, when we see organizations that are not embracing the opportunity to improve their project portfolio management approach, usually, you'll see resources assigned to projects that don't have an established business case or have a weak business case. The project priorities are unclear, and that's something you'll hear across the organization. We're not sure what's important, or they've never been stated, or maybe they've been stated but they haven't been communicated. I mentioned the disconnect earlier a few slides ago about the disconnect between strategy and execution. So a lot of this evidence of the rigor comes through that disconnect. The resource demand for project work far exceeds supply. We see this as a big driver to get people out of the do-nothing mode. When we get calls saying we need help improving our rigor around portfolio and project management, oftentimes it's because portfolios have been committed to, those commitments haven't been delivered, and when we double-click on what that, or even if the organization double-clicks on what the issue is, it's that lack of resource commitment in a realistic fashion, where the demand exceeds supply. Bad projects keep going. That's another cost of poor project portfolio management, and I love asking a mixed audience when there's people from a lot of different companies. How many people in this audience work in an organization with a formal project cancellation process? And the percentages are frighteningly small, and they're getting better, but they're still, in my opinion, unacceptable. Use it or lose it budget. So sometimes projects get done because if we don't spend the money, we're not going to have money next year, which is obviously a sign of lack of rigor. And reliance on the status quo, embracing the changes necessary to implement cultural change. So, we hear this excuse a lot. We have a culturally embedded mindset to how we do projects, and and even more difficult, we have a culturally embedded mindset for how our governance bodies and our executive steering committees drive change. So it's difficult to change culture, and oftentimes is a pretty convenient excuse for dealing with the status quo. So the things Jim was talking about for the efficient frontier or for the right mix for a portfolio, when we talk at the cost-benefit analysis and the risk and many of the other factors that go into optimizing a portfolio. Now we want to talk about what are the dials that we can adjust to produce an optimal output when it comes to changing the organization's approach to portfolio management. So we want to just talk briefly about how we deal with the people, process, technology, and executive support involved in this methodology. Let's talk first about how do you optimize the interaction between these variables to produce optimal results. The answer is it's hard to know which dials to twist. How do we know whether we should add more process or more technology or more executive support or all of those things, or more change management? And so what VIA stands for is vision, implement, and adopt. And so I just want to spend a few minutes on each of these steps here about how we see a successful approach to optimizing portfolio management. And a lot of calls that we get for help are really focused upon the second column. An organization feels some lacking in their internal skills, for example, for setting up Project Server, for connecting it to SQL, for getting the SharePoint activated, for how we provision licenses out to the end users. There's a lot of confusion around that, and appropriately so. But from our perspective, that's the easy part compared to the first and the third boxes, both the vision and adopt. And oftentimes, the implementation receives a lion's share of the focus at the price of inappropriate focus on the vision and adopt phases. So let's talk a little bit about each of these stages. The first one, vision. This is where we think about what the future state's going to be and determine how best to get there. So what's the current state? What's the future state? How wide is the gap? Okay, and then what's the plan for integrating people, process, and technology? So that adjustment of the dials occurs through an approach to say realistically, a question that says realistically, from where we sit today to where we're trying to get to, what are those things that create what I call a feasible leap? What are those baby steps that an organization can go through that are A, worth doing, and B, that are going to produce some kind of results? And then finally, how do we leverage PPM best practices? What are those best practices to move an organization forward? There's logical progressions. When we share our visioning methodology that looks at the 14 portfolio and project management disciplines and looks at their rigor and their adoption and their degree of complexity, what comes out of that is a logical progression for how you move forward things like risk management, resource management, cost management, the 9 PMBOK areas in addition to 5 other areas that we've added to the model. Implement. So this question of, as I mentioned already, a lot of the focus on how we're going to bring process and technology together really at 2 different strata. Here you see the top-down portfolio management and also the bottom-up project management. But to bring those 2 pieces together can be a significant challenge. As many of you know, even to attack one of these layers of rigor can be quite challenging. And then to fit those 2 things together really requires, as it says at the bottom, executive support to spearhead the change. A phased implementation approach. So when we look at feasible leaps, it doesn't take one step or one phase or one project to go from the current state to the future state. So how can we get a realistic set of initiatives in place? Because these are initiatives like any other portfolio. These are projects to bring the organization forward to get better at portfolio management. And then ensure that the people who are impacted by the change understand the new solution. So that really leads us to to the final stage here, which is adopt. And the one that really has the greatest challenges here is getting beyond the final implementation step. You know, when we get to the end of stage 2 and the technology stood up and the processes have been rolled out and the people have been trained and things are ready to go, a number of things that need to happen: the ongoing mentoring and support and coaching, the governance processes that should have been designed and implemented in stages 1 and 2 now have to be actually put into place, and it's a solution assurance, if you will, or a QA process for how project management and portfolio management is ensured to be followed. And then, as Jim mentioned in one of the previous slides, this idea of adopting a continuous improvement mindset that it's never really done. And one of the big challenges really when you get to the implement phase is that there's a sense that because the technology has been turned on, because people have attended training, because the project data has been converted and the portfolio information has been updated, that this somehow becomes a self-sufficient, self-fostering, self-adopting, self-governing model. And really what this is about is recognizing that governance is a process just like any other project or portfolio management process. And so at the end of the day, you know, the question is, which I raised earlier about canceling projects, if the bridge is out, do you have a plan in place to stop the train? And I like to ask that question because to me it's a very easy way to question the portfolio management governance maturity of an organization. A mature governing body will have some formality about how projects are measured, not only once they're put through an initial cost-benefit analysis, but also how that cost-benefit analysis is kept evergreen over time, how it's revisited, and how, if we look at the second box here, these governance processes have things like escalation, have things like intervention, have things like prescribed actions for projects that aren't healthy, and depending on just how unhealthy they are, we run the gamut from canceling the project to replacing the project manager to the other end, which is giving more money, give it what it needs, build the bridge before the train gets there. So these are the key stages in the VIA methodology. So what are the keys to successful adoption? Well, a big one is senior executive buy-in. We see some of these initiatives where there's a desire, I'll say, to get the executives interested. Well, if the executives aren't coming at this interested, I would say that we're looking at an initiative that has a pretty good chance of failure. So executive buy-in at the front end is key and really an important driver. Strong committee leaders, oftentimes meaning a team of executives that are involved in the governance process. Clarification of roles and responsibilities. So like any other project plan, this is a project. A project for change has to be managed like a project, and like any other good scope definition document, roles and responsibilities need to be clear and well communicated. Start simple and evolve the process. So, when I ask an audience, what's the unit of measure for how long it takes to make a change like this, I first get blank stares, and when I give examples of units of measure, I say things like days, weeks, months, quarters, years, and the typical answer is years, right? So that's, for those of us in this business, for those of us who are in an organization where we hope that there's a mood towards improving portfolio and project management, if we finish our sentence by saying, by the way, it's going to take years to do this, we can get resistance, right? So the question is, how do you get those incremental victories along the way? And finally, the process exceptions, right? So when a project gets forced into the portfolio because a senior executive thinks it's a good idea, has expert judgment, has a favorite client that they're trying to do something for, has a sale, the big deal that they're trying to make. All of those things can occur, but the question is, are they really exceptions too? What we often see is if exception is the norm, then they're not really exceptions, right? So we need to eliminate those exceptions as much as possible. So what are the benefits? Well, if you look at the bottom of the screen, the very bottom, which is a statement from our mission, delivering better, faster, more cost-effective project-based results. At the end of the day, there has to be a belief that that's what we're going to do, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But projects address and achieve strategic objectives, right? They are the vessel to carry us to the vision that actually drives the strategy, which is the plan for change. So if we want to plan for change to actually get implemented, we've got to be good at delivering on projects. The other one is, understanding how something fits into the portfolio. Jim mentioned balance, in terms of how a portfolio is structured. So it's not just the project for the project's sake, but how does that project cast against all the other strategic objectives, the business value, the current commitments, the other projects out there, just like your own portfolio. A balanced portfolio doesn't have everything in Apple stock, right? We might have some gold, we might have some bonds, we might have some equities, we might have some cash, and it's that same idea. So also maximizing business value at an early stage and ongoing, right? It's not an annual process, but if we're good at this, we can bring things in and out as the business cases changes, as the cost-benefit analysis changes. We can go ahead and revisit whether the mix is right or not. Reduces the cost for project exploration work. So there's a lot of work on the front end deciding whether things are feasible or not by normalizing the data. Jim used the example of the 3-year CBA versus the 5-year CBA. Just one example of how we can make things comparable and therefore drive some of the bad ideas off the table, which actually reduces exploration work. Project risks are better managed. So one of the things we measure typically in a balanced portfolio is how risky something is. So instead of waiting to approve the project to say this is really risky, why not look at the project overall as it compares to other projects and say, is our risk balanced? There's always a risk-reward scenario in a portfolio, and oftentimes the riskiest projects can produce the greatest benefits, but that's not always the case, right? So we want to make sure we're paying attention to that. Board allocation of skilled change resources is optimized. Okay, so what we do is we actually drive the benefits by having the right allocation of resources across the portfolio. And obviously making priorities clear, right? By bringing the portfolio together and having it be cross business line or cross whatever the scope of that portfolio is, we create clarity, we create transparency, we create the ability to report. A lot of project managers are feeling like shot messengers, right? So a good portfolio process will in fact recognize that establishing and maintaining control within a portfolio means delivering bad news early, makes that acceptable, makes the escalation process smoother, and ultimately prevents messengers from being shot. So this is just a quick snapshot here from an IDC slide that was done back in 2000, or a study that was done back in 2008. And you just see different levels of maturity here between level 1 and level 4. And you look at failed projects in an ad hoc portfolio management environment versus an optimized environment, and you see some pretty striking results. We see an example of alignment with company goals improving as maturity improves. We see a significant reduction in failed projects. Projects over budget reduced by almost a third, or by 2/3. Reduced from 25% to 2%. And a lot of the energy we're seeing around the interest in portfolio management is the fact that redos used to be acceptable and they're becoming less and less acceptable, right? So we can't afford to do it wrong the first time because there's not going to be money to do it a second time. So just a few minutes on next steps. If you're interested in what Project Assistance does, please go to our website. But as I mentioned before, our mission is to provide unique leading-edge solutions that enable better, faster, cheaper project-based results. So how does that happen? If you do it incrementally, it does reduce risk. Incrementally, what we call create a mood towards continued investment. How do we create those feasible leaps that deliver value early? Okay, which therefore means speeding the realization of value and driving effective organizational change. That's what governance and adoption is all about. That's what that third stage of the VIA methodology is about, is really effective organizational change. And as many of you know, the initiatives to improve portfolio management themselves are risky like any other project. They're not guaranteed to succeed. So a good approach is always something we want to have when we approach these things. So our practices, we have the project and portfolio management vision and strategy. That's the VIA methodology. EPM, Microsoft EPM and SharePoint technology implementation. Education and competency development, a lot to do on the people side in terms of driving the change. Application development, oftentimes an interface to SharePoint or enterprise project management tools. Could be HR, could be accounting. Project management staffing. So we actually provide project managers as well as Office 365 in the Microsoft Cloud. So if you haven't heard about the cloud, if you're interested in hearing more about the cloud, please contact us. If you're ready for the cloud, Microsoft solutions will be drastically different in the future. Microsoft, the 600-pound gorilla has entered the cage, and it's time to pay. It's sort of time to sit up and pay attention. So if you don't have a cloud strategy, I suggest you get one. If you need help with the cloud strategy, or if you have a strategy and want to get it implemented, we can help. Also, would direct you to our blog. There's a lot of articles out there, a lot of content out there that you can refer to, some of which refer to our previous webinars, some that probably refer to this webinar, or will soon refer to this webinar. So if you want to, if you want to know if you're ready for a VIA methodology, give us a call. We're happy to do that. We'll review that with you. There's some contact information here on slide 37. Jan Goodman handles follow-up, so I have her contact information here. And also, if you want to see our upcoming webinars, there'll be an announcement within the next week, I believe, for our next webinar. It'll be in our next newsletter, which also will be coming out in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So what I'd like to do is turn this back over to Dan. And the reason I'm turning this back over to Dan is it's your turn as the audience. You may recall that there's a question and answer console on your screen. Okay, so if you look at question and answer, please feel free to submit your questions and answers. I'm sorry, your questions. We'll submit the answers verbally here. And so I'm going to just give it a minute for folks to type in some questions. And Dan, do we have any questions yet?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gus. Thank you very much, Jim. And we do actually already have one question coming in. How much of the demo that you showed today is configured out of the box, and how much requires customization?
I think that's meant for Jim.
Sure, I'll take that one. The demo shown today was 100% configuration. So no customization required to go through that development of the business drivers, the scoring models, or conduct that portfolio analysis. That's all configurable. It uses data. All the data is pulled from the common database, so the project data is pulled right from project information, and then there's some custom fields that you create, but it's all configurable.
Thanks, Jim.
I have another question coming in. Have we seen a best practices for engaging executive support?
That sounds like it's one for me. Best practices, yeah, I would say I've heard the cliche, you should have picked better parents, and this sort of comes to mind here when it comes to executive support. If we don't always get to pick the executives that are supporting our initiatives, but the reason I say that, pick good executives is, I've seen organizations that have executives that understand portfolio and project management. Oftentimes, those executives have grown up in a program management, project management environment, and I see that as a convenience. So when it comes to a best practice, obviously you don't get to pick your executives. So what I've seen is that executives oftentimes haven't grown up as portfolio managers and project managers. So while they may understand the business case that's presented for improving portfolio management, they may understand the impact. When we talk about some of the do-nothing scenarios and some of the downsides of when this doesn't, the cost of doing nothing. They see this stuff. They see the demand for resources exceeding the supply. They see bad projects aren't being canceled. So the fact that an executive has agreed to make an investment, whether it's putting a PMO in place, whether it's hiring outside consultants like ourselves, that doesn't mean they understand what they need, right? So I think one of the things we owe ourselves, when I say we, I'm talking primarily to the audience on here today, on the phone here today. If we're in a PMO, if we're in a portfolio project-based organization, it's our job to educate the executives, to make recommendations, to to offer them the answer. Right now, you know, to try to get them interested, I find that to be a tough one. You know, that's we need executives that are really behind this thing. But even when they're behind it, what I see is a pretty strong need for the team supporting the portfolio to really help educate them and make them comfortable and give them recommendations and make it easy for them to support you.
Thank you. That's all the questions I see on here for now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and hopefully you enjoyed. And remember that we will have the webinar posted on our website, projectassistance.com, if you would like more permanent reference to it. Also, we do have them posted on or we will in the very near future have it posted on our YouTube page for best project assistance. And also posted on there are several other helpful videos for reference. So thank you all very much for joining us today.